too strong to carry on in a black mirror, as I'm a seer, and I fear that the truth is unwelcome there anyway. A power down all around if you're ready to hear. It's so clear, you'll be freer. Step out of your...
Hello, and welcome back. My name's Nicholas Austin. Live again for the third week in a row post my Stranger Than Fiction book coming out this week, which is incredibly exciting. It's an appropriate topic. It's going to be an appropriate topic to talk about today. I think it's going to be really good for... I see more and more people, especially in my orbit, who are starting to write now. So, one, I think it'll be helpful in general for me to talk about this, but also it's super appropriate because I had, like I said, my first of two books came out this past week, Stranger Than Fiction. That one, a book about the COVID era, a history book about the COVID era. Super dense book, 600 pages, 1,600 citations. And honestly, I've been overwhelmed by the response in the first week. I mean, this is by far the best Amazon rank day one. Like the day one Amazon rank was the best that I've had by far on any of my books. As an indie author, it's pretty crazy to see any kind of reaction. Like it takes a long time, and I'm going to talk about that today when I talk about basically every single thing I've learned over 7 years as an author now. As my second book coming out next week is the fifth in a 5-part series, fiction, fantasy, epic, western series called Civillands. The fifth book is Crevice Colossus, and that one comes out next week. I'm also extremely excited about that one. And it's also just cool in general to have like two, very, very different kinds of books, because you kind of hit two different kinds of audiences. I'm going to talk a lot about marketing in a little bit, what I've learned about what that means, what it doesn't mean. But I think today I'm just going to get right into it, talking about, like I said, literally every single thing I've learned about being an author to date, which is a lot. So I guess before I even start with that, though, I'll talk kind of about my journey that kind of taught me those things. So 7 years ago now, around March 2016, I guess it was, I was in a stage in my life where, I was really figuring things out about who I am. I was in college. I was a few years since graduated from college, maybe like 2 or 3 years maybe at that time. And I was trying to, make sense of the world after that, right? And the dedication for my first book is kind of about that, where it's like you have a mountain in college. It's like you have a mountain that you're climbing, right? And graduation is like the peak at the top. And as you're climbing it, there are checkpoints that someone before you set for you, right? Finish these classes, do this, do that, get a job here, do whatever. And you have points that you need to get to, right? You need to climb, and you can see those points while you're looking up, right? And you climb and you climb and you climb and you climb, and then you get to the top, and you're just like, when you get there, you think that it's going to be like an end all be all, right? And you're going to have answers now about how life works and about what to do next. And it's not like that. Like, honestly, you get there and you see a flat plane, right? When you reach the top of the mountain, you think it's just this peak, and it's really just a flat plane. And that's honestly scarier than climbing up the mountain to begin with, because now you have to set your own destinations, right? You have to set your own checkpoints. Those things are not there for you anymore. And so that's honestly, like I said, it's a lot scarier than climbing up the mountain. And for me, I was just in this place where it was like, okay, now what? Right? That it didn't get me any closer to finding meaning in life. Like, I have a job, but now what? Right? And so I think that, at that time I was also watching a lot of TV and movies, and, that was the time where I think Breaking Bad was like coming up towards the end, or it was either over. Maybe it was over by then. But I was getting super into TV shows since Breaking Bad because I really loved Breaking Bad. And from there, from Breaking Bad, I went on to some other stuff. I started watching like The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones, and some of those shows didn't go quite like Breaking Bad went, right? Right? Like Breaking Bad, I thought, right? I mean, not everybody, but I thought that it was pretty close to flawless. Whereas The Walking Dead, started off super good and then fell really fast, in my opinion. And then Game of Thrones obviously was setting up to be even better than Breaking Bad, and then it towards the last season completely fell off a cliff, right? And so at that time, I was just getting really critical of TV shows and movies, and movies are nowadays mostly just remakes, so that's also something to be kind of bitter about. And I was just getting kind of bitter, and I didn't want to be like that anymore. I wanted to if I'm going to be critical, maybe I should just be doing and just prove that I can do any better, right? Who am I to judge these things without actually doing the same, right? And showing that I can do the same. So I didn't know how to write a script, so I started writing books just because I knew what the format of a book looked like, right? And so, like one just boring Monday, I sit down and I start writing out just ideas, right? Just big, the types of things like if you had in Game of Thrones, if you were to summarize it in just one big idea, right, it would be like medieval story without stoic characters, where there's also a zombie apocalypse happening, and if the characters don't come together despite their squabbles, then the zombies are going to take over them all, and they're just going to murder them all, right? They'll all be dead, and then none of their squabbles will have been worth anything. So I was trying to come up with ideas like that, right? Like, what's the cool theme that's going to guide my series that I'm writing, right? What is the cool big idea that's gonna be like the most innovative, crazy thing? And so the first day I was just writing stuff down like that in like a Word document, and I mean, time after time after time, it was just the stupidest things. I would just write something and cross it out and say, "Oh, that's dumb. That sounds cliche. That's dumb. That's cliche." And by the time I was finished, after like I don't even know how long it was, but after some time, I was just like, "These are all stupid," and I just had a blank page, right? So I just scrapped it. I was just at that point, I was just like, "I'm not going to keep going at all. I'm done writing. My writing career is over." But then a week later, same situation, same boredom. I'm sitting there, and an idea just comes to me in my head, like, but not a big idea, just a scene, right? Like as the same way where if you have no concept of the TV show you're watching, and suddenly you turn it on, and it opens up on a scene, and that's all you know is what you see, right? And so that's what pops into my head. So in my head, I see a girl being chased in the woods, right? Just a girl being chased in the woods by men with dogs, right? That's it. That's all I started with. I didn't know it was a Western. I didn't know it was fantasy story. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know where she was. I didn't even know her name. I didn't know who was chasing her. I didn't know why they were chasing her. And what I found was that made it so much easier to start, because starting there, instead of trying to wrap your brain for this crazy, starting at the end, right? Instead of starting at the end, you start exactly at point A, and you just write down what you see, right? Because it's in your mind. So it's just, you just write down what you're seeing in your mind. And this is kind of like the first thing I learned about writing, looking back on it now, which is what I'm deciding to call point A to point B writing. So basically, over the course of writing the first book and now the whole series, 5 books later, like, one of the biggest lessons that I took away from it is where I started where you start has to come first, right? You can't decide what the theme is before you even begin, for the most part. And again, keep in mind when I say any of these things, it's possible that other authors do it different, but I'm just saying what I found. And honestly, in this case, I feel like it took a whole lot of pressure off of me to come up with some big, crazy theme, like I said, because if you just start off with the thing that you want to know more about, then you're already hooked. Your mind is already moving. You're already trying to come up with the greater theme. Like I said, who is she? Why is she running? There's got to be a reason, right? And those reasons come together to make up the bigger theme, which is and this opening scene ends up being a microcosm for the whole series, right? So you start out with who she is, where she's going. And where she's going is the point A to point B. So point A is her being chased, right? Point B is where does she go from there, right? Does she escape? If she escapes, how does she escape? That's the line in between point A and point B, right? But you need to know, like, okay, now I know she's being chased. Does she escape, right? And once you have kind of the A and B, then filling, and everything else is just filling it in between. And when you're filling something in between, you can come up with things that make sense, right? You can say, if she, let's say, in the case of my book, right? Like there's this river that's in front, like she needs to cross this river to escape these people, right? So in order, let's say that she does escape, which you don't know. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. Read the book and find out. But, if she escapes, is it possible that she gets stopped by the river, that she doesn't cross the river? No, right? She has to be able to cross the river, right? If she's being chased, does it make sense that the people chasing her are like on her side? I mean, that's an obvious one. Obviously, they're not for her, right? So what are the reasons that she's being chased, right? These are the things that are in between point A and point B that are much easier to answer once you have the thing that's happening, right? And the destination. Like you can figure out how many steps are in between. Does she climb in a tree? And if she climbs in the tree and then they catch up to her, right? How does that get disrupted, right? How does she get back down and keep going? So it's like I said, there's a lot less pressure, and the general bigger themes kind of come in with editing, right? So point A to point B in the case of my book was a girl being chased, and then how she escapes or doesn't escape that first scene. Where does she end up at the end of just that scene, right? Now, like I said, that is a microcosm, ends up being a microcosm for both the chapter, right? If that's not the end of the chapter, right? If there's more in the chapter, then that point A to point B needs to continue from point B to point C, etc. And you keep kind of extending from there. But book one itself is also a point A and a point B, right? So if you find out that this girl's being chased, and then you find out who's chasing her, that's the interruption of the piece, right? The piece is this girl's just, in her house, just hanging out. Everything's normal. Everything's good. That is the status quo. But a book needs to disrupt the status quo immediately, right? Why are you reading it if it's just status quo, right? You need to know why there's a story. So a book disrupts the status quo. A story disrupts the status quo and tells you how it either gets back to the status quo, because then, there's something to fight for, there's something to overcome, or evolves past the status quo into something better, right? And so, again, these are the steps that you take. And once you get to the point where you have a full path, right, point A to point Z or something, where you go from A to B to B to C to C to D, that's when the picture can start to come together better, because now you have something coherent, right? In the case of Game of Thrones, they start off on the first scene with the theme, right? The theme is that these guys are just off in the woods. These what are they called? the Watchers of the Wall or whatever. I forget because the show is I have so done with it. But they're off beyond the wall, right? And there's this, you see the zombies right off the bat, right? The walkers, the White Walkers. You see right off the bat that they're the disruption in the story, right? They're the thing that makes these people of uh, again, I just it's been a minute since I watched Game of Thrones, but whatever the name of the kingdom is, it's not Middle Earth. Middle Earth is Lord of the Rings. I don't know, whatever. The place that they're in, right? The disruption is these walkers. They're the thing that separates humanity from death, right? And their opening scene in the story is what sets the disruption, right? And then you can continue from there, right? Did they overcome them in the first series? Clearly not. Like in season 1, they do not overcome them. But over the course of the whole series, then, because you just started right off the bat with this horror scene, right? Which is, these walkers just interrupting these guys on their stroll, and this crazy horror scene. You've drawn them in. It's a simple scene, just zombies in a medieval world, right? And now you've drawn people in with that. It's that concept, the bigger concept of, the zombies are the problem with the squabbles. You don't even need to have come up with that yet. All you needed to do was come up with a compelling scene where the zombies are terrifying and intruding on these night watchmen, right? So that's kind of the first concept, right? That's my first of 12. I have 12 things, like general things that I've learned over the course of my writing, and that's kind of the first and the biggest one, is to just keep it simple. Go from one point to another, and don't think as big. I think just one more example of that is in music, right? Like, other than outside of authoring, I've always been into music as well, and specifically, some people, which I'll get to this in a little bit, but know me as Old Wise Bear, and I've worked with Olive Tree Bear writing lyrics specifically for his music. And whenever I write lyrics for him, the way it works basically is he just sends me a track, and I listen through the track and add a vocal with lyrics to the track, right? And there are times, and this is kind of where I first realized this concept in general, is there are times where I'll want to say, what is this song going to be about, right? And usually I don't get very far. Like, I can't start with the chorus. I just can't. Even though the chorus is the rah-rah part of like any song, I can't start with that. I need to start with the first words, right? What do we open in on? And for the most part, because music has a very specific emotion to it, whether there's words yet or not, like even just with the rhythm and the instruments, you get a sensation, a specific sensation. If you listen to metal music, you get a very like bangy sensation, right? If you listen to symphonic music, you probably have something of a build or more peace to it, and it's a very specific emotion. So when you start out, that emotion is already built in for you. So a lot of the times, even if you just start with the first words, it's most likely going to follow the emotion of the song that's presented to you. So Olive Tree Bear does a great job of setting that for me. Like, I don't even have to think about necessarily. I mean, after I start, I definitely do. If I start with a song that's super soft and I'm writing death metal lyrics, it's going to be a little bit off, obviously. But your mind kind of makes the connection if you just start small, right? So with a good example is with the song Silly Game, right? Where it starts out like do, 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 do. And so for people who know it, that might make sense. For everyone else, sorry, that sounded probably weird. But, it's a very like almost James Bondish, like sexy type of rhythm. So I just started off with the words like, do you see me the same? Like, you're just, because you can just imagine like someone in a room listening, like while this is playing, like a girl at a bar and a guy just like checking her out the bar, like James Bond type character staring at her across the bar. And so you're just kind of in someone's head where you're just, if this was the scene, what is he thinking, right? Do you see me the same as I saw you? Like, and in a lot of cases, like, James Bond, they try to make it like he's not thinking about anything, but he is, like everybody is. So yes, that's kind of how you start out the same way in music. It's just a writing technique. It's not even just for books and stories. Anyway, we've already gone through 20 minutes and I've touched on 1 out of 12 topics, so I'll try to keep moving along. Recommendation in general is like once in it's not easy to think through everything that way, everything as point A to point B, right? So sometimes you're going to have like specific characters who have specific traits, for example, and you need to really keep track of those traits. This is a really important thing. Like once you get to book 5, for example, it's really hard to think to remember back to book 1 unless you write everything down. If you have multiple characters, what was this character's trait, right? What were their habits? You have to think about even their mannerisms. Like what did they crack their knuckles, right? A lot? Was that one of their habits? Were they kind of jittery, right? And these are things that unless you continuously reference, and you don't want to continuously reference it, right? You don't want to have it where there's 10 times in a book where you're saying this guy's jittery. It's like you get the point after a while. But once you get to book 5, one, are they still like that? Have they grown out of it? If they have, you need to know that they've grown out of it somewhere in the past. 2, if they haven't, like these are the things that make them who they are. These are the things that make people remember who they are. So you really need to like work to write a lot of this stuff down to very minute details if you want to keep the characters consistent and keep track of who they are and like not only just their characteristics but who they've become, right? So if you have a character at the beginning of book 1, where were they at the beginning and who did they become at the end, right? So in book 1, I have a character who is like a hermit, right? Isn't really as interested with the outside world, just in with their own people, and doesn't really concern themselves with what's going on outside of their own home. So if you have that person at the beginning, right, and their story, because every character needs a beginning and an end, the plot needs a beginning and an end. Every book has to have a beginning and an end, right, for each character and each thread line. So if this person is a hermit in the beginning and they grow out of that at the end, they can't go back to being a hermit, right? Unless something, unless like they come out of their shell and they realize it was the worst thing ever, and now they're just all in on not on being a hermit again. They have to have some kind of reason. But basically the point is if you come back to book 2 now, however they ended on book 1, you have to keep those memories, right? Like if I grow up this year, if I learn something this year, next year I need to be consistent, but not only just next year, 5 years from now, right? Because your lessons build on top of each other. And it's really important to keep that consistency. And so what I would recommend for that, and what I've done for that, is use a program called Scrivener. It's Scrivener, or some other type of storyboarding, where you can keep track of anytime you mention a characteristic of a character, or anytime you mention a characteristic of a place too, to write it down and to keep that in mind, or be able to go back and reference it without reading the whole book again, right? What does this town look like? Where is the jail in this town, right? These are things that you don't want to miss, because if you miss them, somebody else won't. Somebody reading will be like, wait a second, that's not where's the jail? It was to the right, but it was to the east before, and now it's to the west. That doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, a lot of really important details that really help if you have a planner or storyboard of some kind. The next one, super important. I don't think I struggled as much with this as something I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but I did to some extent. the first, especially in my first draft, is show not tell, right? So show not tell basically means it's very similar to the idea of like exposition. So if I'm reading a book and the book says this person did this and then he did that and then he did this and then he did that, you want to be experiencing it as the reader rather than just hearing that it happened, right? You want to be seeing it kind of through that person's eyes so that you can relate to what's happening with that person rather than just being told everything that they're going through, right? So, if they woke up and then they went to get breakfast and then they went to the castle and then they fought a war and then they, you want to at least one of those experiences, not all, you can't do all of them. Sometimes you need exposition to fill in things that aren't entirely necessary but are somewhat necessary to what's happening. You want to be able to kind of keep track, right, of what this person is doing, but also experience it. So if they go fight a war, that's pretty significant, right? That you can't skip over that. Like you wouldn't want to, have one chapter where you're setting up for a war to happen, and then in the next chapter you start the next chapter by saying the war was great and they did this and they did that and then they crossed the river and then the person lost, and then you just cut over to what's happening after the war. I mean, you just missed one of the most important action sequences there is. So you want to experience that, right? Another example of show not tell is when you basically have a character to just describe everything, right? So if you have basically a character catching up with another character and they describe the whole war, again, we just missed the whole thing, right? Imagine the tension you can build by seeing the war happen, right? By seeing whether it's first person or third person, we'll get to that, but imagine the rush you'd get. It'd be like you were in the war rather than just hearing about it after and not seeing it through a person, but just hearing maybe a narrator describe it. There's not as much tension there. There's not as much story being told. It's like the difference of watching a movie about a person opposed to just having someone sit around a fire and explain it, what they experienced, right? They can describe their experience in an exhilarating way, and that's what I mean by show not tell. So if I'm sitting around a campfire describing my war experience, I would say, and then I crawled through the thicket and I was getting shot all around by people in every direction, and so I said to my friend this, and so but I'm in that case describing what's actually happening. I'm showing them what was taking place as opposed to saying, I went to war and then I came back and the war was horrible. It was just horrible. But now here I am. There's not as much, there's gaps there and there's not as much experience going on. So that's a pretty important thing. There's a lot of, examples of show not tell. And this is kind of bleeds into my fourth point, which is just when to use exposition. There are times when you have to use exposition, when you have to tell and not show. Like if you're trying to establish the past, for example, it's not great in a story to be watching something as if it's live, right? So like let's say in the case of my book, you have the girl being chased through the woods, right? That's the timeline. The timeline I've established is what's current, right? In the timeline I've established. Now, let's say she runs and she escapes up a tree and she's up in this tree and they're down there barking at her, and then I cut it and I go to this sequence of her in the past, right? Let's say I tell a story about what her life was like, one morning at home, right? I've just taken the action sequence of what's happening currently and I've interrupted it. And now you're not going to know what's happening to her in the tree. And you're going to hear this long story about, where she is in the past in a place that's more peaceful, right? The interruption has been interrupted. The interruption in the status quo has been interrupted, and now you are kind of taken out of that drama that's been created, right? You're no longer there. You're not experiencing it. And so a better time to use exposition is really just if you have to resolve the first scene first, right? If you resolve how she escaped, right? If she escapes, and then after she escapes, she's going to have to catch her breath or something, right? And even in that case, like let's say she's catching her breath alongside another character. Let's say another character rescues her or something, and they're sitting on a tree trunk, and she's catching her breath. And if you want to express something that happened in the past, like if you want to establish the relationship that she had with like her family or something in the past, right? Then you could have her describe it to the person that she's sitting with in the present, right? In the present moment of the book, where she is still in that escape scene, post that escape scene at this point, but it's still the present. Like the book is still moving forward in a timeline, but you could still establish through her, what the emotions were, and you could do it better because you can have her living it through another person, right? So if that person says, I bet you miss them a lot, whoever she's talking about having, come from in the past, right? Then you could experience her reaction to that person's words. And then you can be more building the dynamic between these two characters rather than just showing like this scene from the past and then having her cry or something, right? Because you learn something about her to some extent, but you're missing an opportunity to build this relationship between her and whoever saved her that's sitting on this tree trunk, right? That's a great opportunity to establish future storylines between these two characters now. And so again, that's kind of the show, not tell, and exposition piece. A couple more things on the writing itself and the words themselves. Two more things specifically. So first, dialogue, and this is by far the area that I struggled with the most when I first started. And everybody's got a different struggle in the beginning, right? Like I've been editing / reviewing a book that someone started writing, and their dialogue was really good for a first time writer, very natural. And that's the key, right? When you have a natural conversation with someone, maybe you don't, but I definitely have a tendency to interrupt, right? If somebody says something that makes me think about some idea and I want to respond with that idea, I have a tendency to butt in. That's just, the way that I am, for better or definitely for worse. But and so people in general have that tendency, right? Like while you're talking to me, I'm thinking of something else or something supplemental, but still you have a tendency to not listen 100%, right? And you have a tendency to want to either build, like I said, or change the subject if it's a weird conversation or whatever, right? But your mind is, part of your mind is in a place that this person, that is other than this person's words. It tends to be. And so in a normal conversation, you get people getting cut off and interrupted. So this is an easy way to build good dialogue, is to have just normal interruptions, not too many interruptions. You don't want to just constantly have people cutting people off, but again, just little subtle things that kind of, they have to make sense at the given time, right? What is this character's motivation to interrupt this person, right? Like I said, in my case, that might be you say something super insightful and it inspires a thought in my mind that I really want to build onto it, right? I really want to add to your thought. And so maybe I interrupt you and you get cut off. And that's because people have different motivations, right? And that's another thing to think about. Other than interruptions, what if, in normal conversations, you'll see people who will say something entirely off topic, right? In a normal conversation, maybe, I mean, the easiest example is if you are talking about, dinner to me, right? What you're going to get for dinner. And then I'm like, oh God, I forgot to check the mail today. Like something completely different, right? And these things are very frequent in normal conversations, these types of imperfect interactions that don't just go, respond, statement response to the statement. It's not always like that. You're going to have some imperfection there. And that's natural in conversation. And it's best to try to, for the most part, not in every case. I guess sometimes you might want to, like if a character is inhuman, you might want to make them talk a little more precise if they're like a robot or something. But for the most part, with humans, they're not perfect. So you want to have that natural level of kind of imperfect back and forth. So that's one thing with dialogue. Another thing is just not using, again, like the exposition thing. You don't want to use too much exposition, right? So if you have that scene I was describing before where you have a character sitting on a log with another character, you don't want the first character to just spend the whole time describing the past, right? You want some kind of back and forth in the moment still, like what is happening now, right? The person sitting next to the character describing the past acknowledges, the fact that they're crying right now, right? Interrupts the past description to just speak about something that's happening now. So that's kind of another thing. And just in general, dialogue being too wooden, being too descriptive, just tends to not feel right. I think one mistake people make is they a lot too many times will have one character say another character's name, right? So if the characters' names are Bob and Jim, they're like, Bob, I have to go to the bathroom. Oh, okay, Jim. Bob, I'm hungry. Oh, okay, Jim. Yeah, me too. I'm hungry too. Do you want to go get a burger, Jim? And they'll just keep doing that kind of like thing where you actually address them by their name. And it's good maybe to have that like once, maybe, like, but even then, not often, right? Because over the course of like a normal day, like if I'm hanging out with my friend Bob, I'm not gonna while I'm hanging out with Bob, I'm barely gonna call him Bob, or most of the time, you're barely gonna say, "Oh yeah, totally, I know Bob. I know what you mean by that." I mean, you're never gonna really address them by their name for the most part. So, but occasionally you might, and so just fitting it in the right number of times, not overdoing it. I'm sure there's so many other things on dialogue that I'm not thinking of, but it's pretty important. But that's kind of some of the most important things. All right, we're through 5 things, and I'm at 38 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep this moving. Point number 6, point of view. This is super important. So, point of view basically means, especially for someone who's writing fantasy, it's super easy to get into like 15 different points of view, or even to just take the omniscient point of view, right? So point of view basically means you can have first person point of view, which means you're describing the story through the person as themselves, right? So if I wrote a first person point of view book about my life, I would say, and then I started live streaming and I started talking about my experiences authoring, right? That's first person point of view, what I'm describing right there about what I'm doing right now. And some books are like that. I think, what's the one with Hayden Caulfield? I don't remember that, whatever, that book. I'm pretty sure like he describes what he's doing in the moment. He describes himself as I, and it's super important that if you do that, you only see what the character can see, right? That's critical. Because if you're following me right now, and my wife is at like the store, I can't know what she's getting at the store right now. So if you're following my story, and then in my story I suddenly write, and then my wife picked up the tomato sauce off the shelf, right? You're not following me anymore. And it's going to be distracting every time you do that because you're the limitation is honestly a super helpful thing because it helps you relate more. Like you can see me more instead of saying, instead of seeing every other thing. Like if you were going to do something like that, right? Let's say that in the story I get hit by a car, for example, right? And I'm walking down the street. You tell me what's more shocking, right? So I went outside and I looked both ways and I started crossing the street and I got hit by a car, right? Or I went outside and then, my neighbor Janice was speeding down the road, not paying attention she was on her phone and she was on a call and she was talking to her mom about this and that. And then she ran. And then as I'm crossing the street, she ran me over with her car. Like there's not as much impact. There's not as much because the same way that if I was crossing the street, I suddenly get hit by the car, right? You're not experiencing it suddenly. It's not a shock to you. And you want it to be a surprise, right? In the case of a book, right? I don't want to be surprised and get hit by a car. But in the case of a book, you want there to be that jolt. You want to provide that twist, I guess you could say. Whereas if you just describe what's going to happen, you can already see it happening. You're not going to be, it's not going to provide any shock value. So that's the idea of first person point of view. The next two are third person unlimited or third person limited and third person omniscient. And so third person limited is very similar to first person in that you still have a limited number of characters. Instead of saying instead of saying I crossed the street, now you would say Nick crossed the street, right? So it's not me telling it anymore. It's some third person, narrator telling it about what I'm doing as I'm crossing the street, except it's limited in the number of perspectives it can follow. So still, even though it's third person, right, you still can't know what that girl the neighbor driving in the car who hit me in the car, what she's doing, right? You're still limited to the fact that I am crossing the street and then boom, I get hit by the car. Because you can't, even the narrator in this case, even though the narrator is separate from me as it's being written, you still can't get outside of my thoughts and what I experience, which again helps a lot in terms of adding to, the mystique, right, of what the reader is allowed to know and what the reader can only find out later when I suddenly get hit by the car, right? And so in my fiction books, use third person limited. And again, this is something that I came across thanks to my editor, and I'll get into editors next. But this is the idea of why you would use third limited versus third omniscient, which third omniscient basically allows you to look at everyone's point of view, right? So that's kind of what I described first, where I said Nick crosses the street and then the neighbor is in her car and she's on her phone and she's talking to her mom and she's just sick of the call with her mom, right? And this is omniscient because I can get in her head even, right? I can describe what her thoughts are even, which you can't do in limited, right? Or first person, because you don't know what someone else's thoughts are. And that's more human to not know, right? So that's kind of why with first person and third person limited, you can connect more with the characters and with their experience that they're having. That is kind of the three points of view, right? And it's important to figure out right off the bat which one you want to do, both for the sake of, the shock value that you can provide, like the limitations, the relatability. I would recommend, especially for fiction, either first person or third limited, just because of the relatability, like I said. But people do third omniscient, and it turns out just fine. So there's ways to do it both ways, but it's just super important that you decide right off the bat. Because if you decide to do, or if you don't decide, right, and you have times where, a big mistake you can make is if you have times where certain scenes are limited, right? Like where you write certain scenes where they're limited, and then some other scenes, like if I'm in a shootout, if I'm in a duel with someone, right? And my back is to their back, and you're just describing my thoughts. You're like, he was terrified, he was shaking in his boots, he didn't know what to think, he didn't know how quick of a draw the guy behind him was, and then the guy behind him was also worried. It's just distracting, right? It's distracting, and especially because you want consistency. So again, like if you have that in one scene where you can see the guy behind him's thoughts, but then all of a sudden, like never after that, you can. Again, this is just the same type of inconsistencies that you'd see if you don't keep track with like a storyboard type of thing. Okay, we're doing pretty good on time now. I'm getting kind of along through this list of 12. Next, editors. Again, editors help with a lot of this stuff. A lot of the things that I've already mentioned to this point, couple or definitely dialogue and point of view especially, but some also exposition, are things that editors pick up on immediately. They're trained to pick up on it, obviously, and they can help you a lot with that. You for the most part, if you're writing your first book, you need an editor. Absolutely. Like honestly, you always need an editor, like of some kind, right? At minimum, like a beta reader, right? Somebody who reads it before you publish it, to at least, be able to tell you what's missing, right? Where things don't make as much sense. You need someone, just anyone, who's going to be critical in some kind of way. But in the first book, especially that you're writing, or the first couple, you absolutely need to hire someone to edit your book. There's too many things that you can't know. There's too many words. I mean, the average fiction book, I would guess, is probably like 50 to 100,000 words. That's a lot of words, right? For you to be keeping track of while you're thinking of things like, who is this character? Where are they now? Where are they later? Where do they go? All these things that you have to think of. To be thinking of also grammar and making sure every word is in the right place. And, also even just making sure the plot is consistent. Sometimes you get too attached to a story, it's hard to see these things. It's an exhausting process writing a full book. So sometimes it's hard sometimes it's impossible to see yourself where something is missing, because it might make sense in your head, but you're not exactly reading it with the most critical eye and from the same detachment that someone else would be. And so that alone makes having anyone read your book beforehand extremely important. When it comes to hiring an editor, though, it can get somewhat expensive if you don't, do your due diligence. So I would say, like, the way that most editors seem to charge is per word. So they'll charge like a cent per word or some around there. And so it can add up. If you have 60,000 words, it can definitely add up. And so you don't have to hire some crazy professional, expensive editor every single time. But again, these are just things to keep in mind. It's super important to hire one if you want the product to be, what you hope it will be at the end. But it also is pretty expensive, and you need to keep track of the costs, right? How they charge, which is, again, most of the time. Sometimes they charge a fixed fee, but most of the time it's by the word. One place you can find editors, and I actually didn't even write this down as one of my 12 things, which is crazy. But you also want to hire, cover people, right? Interior people. You could do that yourself, but again, if you're not a professional designer, you want it to look good, right? You don't want to put out something that doesn't look professional. You want the reader to look at it and think this is a real book, as a lot of people would describe. So you definitely want to hire the right people to do the interior, because you need to format the interior correctly per like Amazon's rules or wherever else you're going to publish it. And also the exterior, obviously you want a catchy cover that people are going to like, right? Where I go for both of those things, for editors and designers, has been a website called Reedsy. It's Reedsy, REEDSY.com. Basically, you can actually bid or you can put out a request to a variety of editors and designers. So like if I have a project for my first book, I can put out a request to like 5 different editors and they can come back to me with their proposals and I can pick the best one for me, right? So that's a great resource for finding the best rates and being able to compare and understand what typical rates are. And I've just had nothing but good experiences on Reedsy to date. They actually have like reviews too that people give, so you can find the most talented, most cost-effective person there is out there for your project. I think they even have marketers on there. I've never used one, but I'll get to that in a little bit. The next thing is publisher or self-publishing versus finding a publisher. This is really key to decide right up front, especially if you need to know what your goals are, right? For me, I just wanted to write a book. I wanted to write a story for me. I wasn't really a reader growing up, so I didn't have, visions of book awards, like, the New York Times bestseller list or that little, what are those little award things that they put on the front of a book, those little gold coin looking things. But I didn't really think about any of that. I'm not in book clubs. I was never in book clubs. So I didn't really have kind of an idea of what a famous, author achieves, right? I just wanted to tell a full story that I could be proud of. And so for me, self-publishing made by far the most sense because, one, I wanted full control of it. I didn't want any extra influence over what I was writing, which today is super important to me also. But at the same time, right, it is a lot harder to sell books if you are a self-published author, okay? A lot. And the reasons why are primarily marketing and distribution. So it's super easy to publish a book as a self-published author, right? Amazon makes the process extremely easy. Anyone can publish a book on Amazon if you go to Kindle Direct Publishing. As long as you get the dimensions right, which you can find YouTube videos on how to get the dimensions of the cover and the interior right. It's as easy as just submitting a couple files, right? And hitting publish. The thing that makes it such a challenge, right, is again, if you have the goal of getting it in bookstores, right? If your local bookstore holding a copy, Amazon has expanded distribution where you can get your books into places like that, but you need to achieve a level of success that's difficult without a network, right? It's difficult without marketing because building a brand, people do not understand, is so hard, right? It's such a long-term or even short-term, but like in the case of maybe you go viral but that's luck for the most part. Skill a little bit, but also you need to have some fortune there. And so you need to build a brand that people are going to want to come back to. And as a first-time author, that is so hard, right? Why? A book is a long thing to read. The one I just published a couple of days ago is 600 pages, right? Now think about this. What are your primary things that are going to make you read a book? Most likely, the first one would be someone recommends it to you. Someone says you have to read this, right? Whether that's for school or for just in your personal life, if your family member or friend recommends a book, you're probably going to want to read it, right? You're more inclined at least to read it than if you were to just pick it up. The other thing is just general reviews, right? If you see a book with just incredible reviews, the same way I started watching Game of Thrones because everybody was telling me how great it is. These are super important to build up over time, is good reviews and getting people who really like your books. Now, again, think about this for a second. I don't know about you. My wife reads tons of books, okay? Her goal is 40 this year. That's not the average person. right? I used to never read books. I read them now, but even now that I read them more often, and probably I would say I'm about average now, probably pretty close to average, maybe above slightly. But I read probably like between 3 and 5 books a year, right? And because the other thing is too is I usually read nonfiction and they're usually really long. So maybe that's slightly above considering that, right? But if you think about it, again, 3 to 5 books a year. Let's say I even read them evenly distributed throughout the year, so they each take me 2 months. So you publish a book that each person that reads it is going to take 2 months to finish it, at least. Okay, some people longer. Some people, are super busy. Maybe they can only finish a book a year, if that, if even one. There were years where I didn't read any books, right? So they're going to take all sorts of time to finish it. And then, of all the people that finish it, only a percentage are going to review it, right? Some people might not even think to. Some people might not have Goodreads, right? Or some people might have Amazon, but maybe they finish it and they get busy the next day and they forget. Or maybe they don't even really review anything ever. They just don't even think that this is a thing to do, right? That concept you have to understand is, so you have to sell people with no reviews, right? What you have to do right off the bat is you have to sell people who have no prior reason to think that you're good, right? That your book is worth reading. You have to sell them, and then you have to get them to leave reviews after you get them to read it, right? It's a tough thing. Obviously, there's many steps in this process, right? Where this type of person can fall out and not review you at all. This is why when I say like you need to be doing it for a long time, 7 years now I've been doing it. And even now it takes time, right? Like over the course of these years, I've built up a decent number of reviews. Could I have built up more? Should I have been doing more marketing? Should I be doing more marketing now? Should I be doing these live streams more often? Probably, yeah. But I'm in a place now where the number of reviews I've built up is starting to sell my books. Now, again, as a first-time publisher, though, as a first-time author, you have to think, like, how can I make this process quicker? And the answer for probably is to give books away for free, buy books for people. And this is kind of the next concept that I have of finding a few biggest fans, quote unquote. This isn't a concept that I came up with. I read it in some kind of book. But if you can find one or two people who you get hooked, right? Completely hooked, waiting for your next book. Those people can sometimes be such a positive referral that they can bring in 2 or 3 others, right? And every couple people that they bring in, you end up with more and more social credit, right? So like I said, when you build up all sorts of reviews, all those reviews, all those 5 stars with the number next to it, that number, bigger it gets, right? Of how many reviews you have. Every single one of those is proof to a prospective person who might read it that it's worth their time, that there will be a social benefit to them to doing it, that they will be able to read it and then talk to their friends about it, right? So you need to get that first person. All you need to do is get that first person to 10 people to 100 people in the door and build those up over time. It's not just, right off the bat. But those people who fit your genre, who fit your story, and who will advocate for you, who will get hooked and who will post about it and who will, tell their friends and tell their family. It doesn't take much with those people, right? It takes a few. And in order to get them those people right off the bat, because again, even they don't know you to begin with, you have to give stuff away for free to some extent. And even if not for free, just offer them something back. Be incredibly nice to them. Do anything it takes to make it worth it for them. right? And those are the people that I'm most proud of to date. Is I have a few of those types of people, and that's what's kept me going. You know, and you start with one, and then you get two, and then you get three, and it's just a process over time that it makes the whole experience so much more enjoyable, and it amplifies kind of your marketability. And the kind of the next topic that I'll say, still related to marketing, is to not even think about it like marketing. Again, in the case of the few biggest fans, you want to find you're most likely going to relate to them on some level, right? Because if they relate to your work, it's your work. It's you. It's you built it with your brain and your blood and sweat and your tears. And so most likely you'll have something in common with them. Don't To think about them as a fan to me is kind of absurd. It's like this is someone who could be your friend, right? Who you could relate to uh deeper than just saying, that they're looking at you like some kind of idol, standing like a statue or something. Like it's more than that. And the next topic that I will say to try to accomplish, not even accomplish, but just to use to your benefit is just be social as much as possible and try to find groups of people with similar ideas. So this is something that I'd read in books, and I didn't understand it at first, what it really meant. So in a lot of marketing books that you read, and with a lot of successful people, you'll see them say, find a community and become a part of the community, and then offer what you have to that community, right? And at first, I used to think about that in terms, and this is way before, before I even started writing. I would just read, or watch a video of some Gary Vee type person, and they would say this type of thing. And so I would hear that, and I would say, you start to think about it transactionally, even though they're telling you not to. Okay, even though I'm sure Gary Vee he would 100% be like, you can't think about it transactionally. You still do, in a way. You still think about it to the extent of like, okay, how can I use this to sell books or whatever, right? And that's a mistake. And the reason why is I'll explain. So I benefited from this concept in a huge way because of the Bears, right? So I am a big fan of comedian Owen Benjamin. I think he's hilarious. And over the years, I was involved loosely in the community he calls the Bears. I was just in comment sections wherever, right? Just no one really knew who I was. I didn't even have a bear name at the time, as they come up with in that community. I was just just a watcher from afar. I was a bear without a name, right? And over the course of those years, some people would follow my page that were bears, whether they saw my comment or something, they would start following me. And one of the people who started following me was named Olive Tree Bear, right? And I had posted something on my page, some kind of sea shanty, and I've talked about this, I think, probably in a previous episode, so I won't go too deep on it. But I had posted a sea shanty. Olive Tree Bear contacts me and says we should make a sea shanty for the bear community, right? And so this is the community that I'm just a part of, just because I think Owen Benjamin's hilarious. It in no way occurs to me that that there could be that I'd be selling people on books in this community. Okay, I literally had not the least bit of idea. This community benefited me as a human being by bringing me closer to Christianity, giving me something to laugh about during really dark times in the world in general, and helping me make sense of the years that I was talking about just a little bit before, about when you graduate and from college, for example, and you need to make sense of the world. This is a group of people who helped me do that. They had already given me everything that I could have wanted. I didn't want anything more than that. I didn't need anything more than that. I already had a job. It's like this writing in general is a hobby to me. Okay. I would like to more and more become professional as an author, full-time author, but I'm not there yet, right? And I do not did not join a community to do that, right? To be able to become that. In no way. But I was a part of the community, and I happened to have one of the people contact me, and he happened to be extremely talented at making music, and I happened to be a songwriter and a singer and be really into music, and we made a song, right? And we made a bunch of songs, and then we released those songs, and our influence in that community increased to some degree, right? We made a name for ourselves by showing by not even benefiting from our talent, but offering our talent to others, making songs that people themselves would benefit from. And it's so basically the point I'm saying is you join these communities for a mutual benefit, not to sell anything. You're probably the thing is like if you're starting to write a book, you're probably already part of a community like this in some degree, right? In some form or fashion. You're probably already part of a community of some kind of interest that you have. It could be sports for some people, right? Maybe you're in a fantasy league or something. There are people around you who you relate to, right? And so you can give to those people. In the case of the Bears, like it was music for me. I haven't made a dime off of it. I don't expect to make a dime off of it, but I was able to contribute to that community with songs that made them extremely happy, right? And from there, right, because we have stuff in common, me and Bears, because I'm a bear and I have stuff in common with bears, I ended up writing a book about the COVID era, and this happens to be a community that is very awake-minded, right? Acknowledges the truth when it's right in front of them instead of pretending that it's not happening. And so I just happened to write a book that interested me about this time, and it's been very successful, very God willing it will continue to be very successful, and thank God has been very successful this week so far because of this community that I just happened to be a part of, that just wanted to support me just because I contribute to it the way it contributes to me and my life. And so extremely important, because again, most of the time, like, these communities are already there. You don't have to build them, right? It's not even for the purpose of selling anything. It's just people who you have stuff in common with. This is your target audience in general, even if you think about that concept of a target audience, right? Really, they're just your friends. But even if you think about the concept of a target audience, like those are the kind of people who would be it. They're the ones who think like you and who want to consume what you have, what you consume, etc. We're already at an hour and 10. Sheesh. How much do I have left? I think that's probably actually pretty close. Again, I can't give a ton of background on if you want to go to the publisher route, right? I have not published with a publisher. I've thought about it at times. It probably would be easier with this route. I had to build my own website at first, and then I, hired someone to build me a better one. But for me, I think it was very rewarding just because I like the challenge too. I want to learn about marketing. I want to learn about, what the process is of making a book. I like being independent and doing it myself. That's not efficient, right? You want to sell the most books you can? I would probably say don't do that. If your goal is to be a New York Times bestseller or to have that little gold coin thing on the front of your book, I wouldn't recommend self-publishing. It's hard. It's really hard. You have to go through periods like I'm in literally right now, live streaming this, where no one's paying attention, and that's fine, right? But because if you keep doing it, like I'm brand new to doing this live streaming thing, if I do this for another year, that number of viewers will probably be closer to 50 or something. I don't know. We'll see what happens a year from now. But it's the same thing with the fact that I've been writing now for 7 years, and my opening day for my first of 2 books coming out this month was incredible. Incredible. Like nothing I've experienced before. And that in a big way is just because you keep doing it. You just have to keep doing it. If there's something that you want to build, you have to persevere. It's all time, right? It's all time and effort. And in 7 years' time, right? You start writing day one, where you're scrapping things and then just rewriting. Next thing you know, you'll have 6 or 7 books like I have on my website, and you'll say, when people perceive you now with 6 books written or 7, I have 6 written and 1 I published for my grandpa that his dad wrote. When people look at you now, you're an author in their eyes. With 6 books, you're a prolific author in their eyes. And you are. Whether you wrote books that have universally 1-star reviews or universally 5-star reviews, you are more prolific author than 99% of people who either don't ever write or who write and then give up after a couple years because it's not going where they want it to go. And if you're prolific, that itself can get people to read books. He wrote 6 books. Wow, that's impressive. He must be decent at it, right? And even if your first ones aren't decent, again, another concept that I learned that I should have wrote down here and didn't. But even if your first ones aren't decent, this is another super, super important thing, is you're going to learn over time, right? I don't think that, I might be wrong. I'm 90% sure I'm not wrong, but I'm pretty sure George R.R. Martin's first series was not Game of Thrones that he wrote, right? The only way you can write Game of Thrones is to get better at writing, to improve over time. And I know it sucks to think about this because I didn't want to think about this when I first started either. But maybe your first series isn't the one that takes off. You don't want to feel like you're wasting time, right? That sucks to think about. What if I spend 7 years on this series and it's not the one to take off? That would suck. And it, in a way, it would. Kind of. But you can't think about it like that because without that series, you don't get the one that doesn't suck. Without persevering through it, you can't write the one after it. Without the first 4 books in the Civilland series, I could not have written Stranger Than Fiction. Right? Without writing Stranger Than Fiction, I could not have finished the Civilland series. Everything builds on it, on top of the last thing you did. It's all part of the process. And you have to be willing to continue to struggle through it. Write in silence. Write when no one gives a shit. Right? Because no one will at first. You're going to send books off to people that you want them to review or that you want to get their feedback on, and they won't reply. Or they will reply, and then they won't follow up with the feedback. Because people are busy, and a book is long, and not everyone reads. But they don't want to tell you no at first, so they'll agree to it. And that's hard. Very hard, but you have to deal with that. You have to take that punch, and you have to move on and find the next person who has more in common with you, who does like reading, and you have to give them something. It's not all just taking. This is a huge issue I've found with playing music, right? Every musician thinks, this song is going to just blow minds, and it's going to get 1 million views, and it's the greatest song. Bullshit. It's not just the song. It's who you are. It's what goes into the song. It's who listens to it first. Who do they share it with? Do you put it out there enough? Do you play live shows enough? Do you have that one true fan? Do you have any true fans? Do you just have people who passively say, "Oh, that sounds good, but I don't really listen to this genre"? Have you put in the time to reach the type of people that you need? Because it takes a long time, right? It takes luck. It takes presenting that song to the right person. But overall, you can't do it unless you produce as much as humanly possible for as long as humanly possible. And if you love writing, if you love music, that shouldn't be hard. Because it's a passion. It's something that you would do until you die. Something that you wouldn't retire from. Right? And that's what it's been for me. And there are times, like I said, where I have had to put a book down, right? Where I was writing the 5th book in the Civil End series, and I got a certain length of the way through it, and COVID started, and I couldn't focus at all, right? Because life was stranger than fiction. And so I said I have to write this COVID book first. Otherwise, I won't be able to give this finale what it deserves. So there are times where you have to put it down. There are times where you have to put down writing altogether, right? Maybe you're just not in the space to do it for a period of time, but you can't stop permanently. Explore something else for a period of time, live stream for a period of time, make music for a period of time. But over the course of years, you have to keep producing and keep building and working toward it. Otherwise, the same thing as any career, right? Any career is built like that. It's easier to see how a college job turns into a career, or how any job, that you make money directly from right off the bat turns into a career. But you're really trained on those over the course of years also. Think about how long college is. Imagine where you'd be if you put in the amount of time you put into college for 4 years on something that you liked doing, right? Think about the amount of time you spent studying in school, and the amount of time you spent, even if you didn't go to college, like the amount of time in high school, even the number of years and the amount of time of your life that you spend thinking and doing that kind of stuff. Imagine if you spent that length of time and that effort on something like writing and authoring, if that's the thing you like. It's amazing. And 7 years later, I can say it's so worth it. So worth it. But you can't stop. That's the key. Okay, I think that is about everything. We're at an hour 17. Sheesh, this is the longest. Well, it might be the longest episode I've ever done. I don't want to stop though. So let's talk about a few things before I sign off. Just a few fun things. Not writing related, but just fun. First, let's talk about our favorite little rat, Anthony Fauci. LifeSite News says Anthony Fauci among the government officials who must hand over big tech censorship emails. This is chapter 3 of Stranger Than Fiction. If you want to know everything there is to know about the conspiracy between the government and big tech to censor people illegally at the expense of the First Amendment, as clearly defined that they're not allowed to do in the First Amendment, you can read Stranger Than Fiction, chapter 3. There are quotes directly from these people. The press secretary before the current one, the redhead, multiple times just outright stated it, right? That the executive branch was working with big tech to censor people. The CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, said that that the CIA was in contact with him to censor misinformation. Just across the board. One of the most corrupt, you can't even imagine, right? And it was planned, and so much of it was theorized beforehand at Event 201 and stuff, but I won't get too much into that. For now, it's just funny. And then here's another funny thing. Rockefeller Foundation wants behavioral scientists to come up with more convincing COVID narratives. You want to know the irony about this? So there's, and I'll cut it with the sharing there. But there is something in my book about how Yale University, right? At the time, or I don't know, maybe it was last year. Yale University did a study on messaging behind the inoculations, right? They were trying to figure out the best messaging to get people to take the shots. And they tested messages of fear, right? Scaring people. They tested messages of guilt. They tested messages of science denial, right? Shame. And to the average person, you read that and you're like, these people are psychopaths, right? Like you're studying how scared people get. Like you're willing to scare them, right? And psychologically abuse them in order to get them to do what you want. Like, it's the scummiest thing ever. And they just openly, they call it a study, right? They just say it's a study. And that gives it legitimacy somehow to shame and scare people and psychologically abuse them. It's incredible. And so you see this thing like this Rockefeller thing, like how do we get better narratives to get people to want to inject themselves with this experimental thing that doesn't work, that both doesn't work towards the stated aim and is also extremely dangerous and basically has crazy risk and zero benefit, right? And they don't realize that every time just the strategizing alone, like, do you want to convince people? Stop openly strategizing about how to convince them, because it's achieving the opposite. There's zero situation, zero circumstances, zero, where I take your little poison, okay? Zero. Because you're obsessed with it, right? Because you clearly want it inside of everyone, whether there's a benefit or not, like Fauci said at the Milken Institute, that he didn't want to have to prove. He didn't want to have to prove that it worked. Do you want to figure out why people are not hesitant but refusing? It's because you have not tried to hide the fact that there's no benefit, that the deception behind it. It's too late. You've already failed. And then these people just don't ever seem to get that. And if you want more on how crazy they are, join the masses. Read Stranger Than Fiction. Get your copy today. It's on Amazon. Maybe there's a link in the description here. I don't know. If there isn't, there's a link to my website. But I think there might be a link to my Amazon page. You can buy that, and you could buy the fiction series. Hopefully you enjoyed this talk today. It was a super long one, but hopefully it was informative on everything that I know about writing. If you are thinking about writing, definitely take these things into consideration. A lot of it I wish I knew right off the bat, but I couldn't. So hopefully it'll save you a lot of time. I'll be back next week. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about, but gotta keep it chugging, gotta keep plugging along. And like I said last week, it's not like my first medium. Talking to a camera is not instinctual to me, but I'm kind of enjoying it. I like just expressing my thoughts and getting it out there, stream of conscious into the ether. Maybe I'll start, pushing this more. Hopefully get some more and more views. I saw my last video got a decent amount of views. Pretty excited about that. Got a bunch of likes. Anyway, have a good weekend. Hopefully Texas beats Alabama this weekend. That's not going to happen, but we'll see. Maybe. And until next week, I'm Nicholas Austin. We'll be back next week when Crevice Colossus comes out. Maybe I'll talk about that then. Check out my blog. I posted a new blog post this week. I'm going to try to get one out every week. It's not going to be as easy as streaming every week, but I'll do my best. Anyway, have a good weekend. Talk to you guys again next week. Peace.